Hi, my name is Journey, and my pronouns are she and her. I'm so glad I have this opportunity to speak with you about transgender folks and what we would like you to know. Here is a startling, eye-opening fact. As of January 2024, conservative politicians in almost half of all our states have now passed laws that limit the human rights of transgender and gender diverse people. These laws restrict trans individuals from such basic rights as using public restrooms, playing in school sports, getting life-saving gender-affirming health care, and obtaining correct legal documents such as driver's licenses. There are also book bans and restrictions against schools teaching about LGBTQ plus topics. In some places, there are even regulations preventing teachers from using the names and pronouns with which trans students identify. All this discriminatory legislation goes hand in hand with a boatload of misinformation, disinformation, and myths that have been widely shared on social media, in Congress, in state capitals, and in the news. Much of the public remain poorly informed or misinformed regarding these issues. And yet, as the saying goes, when we know better, we do better. With that in mind, I will share some of the insights gained from my own transition and what I have learned from many others, including addressing the most prevalent, misleading, and damaging myths and falsehoods that are circulating today. A fundamental place with which to begin is the widespread lack of understanding about what it means to be transgender. Most people are born with their body's sex matching up with the gender identity in their brain. This alignment is called being cisgender or cis. Being transgender means a person's birth-assigned sex does not conform to the internal, deeply held gender identity in their brain. And modern medical science has found that it's way more complicated than the simplistic XXXY girl-boy chromosome model that we first learned about decades ago. This graphic is a very visual and helpful way of explaining it. Take a look. Being trans is not a choice or lifestyle. It's just the way some individuals like me are born. Such variations are a normal part of the vast spectrum of human experience, and it's been this way since there have been people on Earth. This variation probably occurs in less than 1 person out of 100. That is, for example, somewhat less than the number of people born with red hair, but it still adds up to a lot of individuals around the world. Just imagine if red-headed people across the nation were restricted from obtaining necessary health care, using public restrooms, playing on school sports teams, and had to hide their natural hair color to be more safe. That would simply not be acceptable. The discrepancy between a person's body and their mind, also known as gender incongruence, may cause the individual to experience strong emotional distress and discomfort, which is called gender dysphoria. One of the latest myths being promulgated by anti-trans activists is a totally made-up so-called syndrome known as rapid onset gender dysphoria. It is absurd to claim that people suddenly decide to become transgender. Again, being trans or gender diverse is just how some individuals are born. Another widespread misunderstanding is the conflation of people's gender identity, meaning who someone is, with their sexual identity, meaning to whom they are attracted. Gender identity and sexual identity are two separate and different facets of being human. Furthermore, transgender folks, just like cisgender people, may have a sexual identity that is straight, gay, bisexual, pansexual, or none of the above. And when it comes to kids, transphobic critics continue to cultivate this same erroneous mashup of gender and sex. Why this fixation on sex? In truth, most children developmentally first know their gender identity years before they are even aware of their sexuality. There is a related, widely held belief that young children can't possibly even know their own gender identity. The fact is that, as a normal part of childhood development, both cisgender and transgender youth do recognize from an early age how they identify. Think about it. When did you first know you were a girl or a boy? Please take a moment to consider this. Many children between the ages of about 15 months to around 3 years old naturally begin gravitating to stereotypical girl or boy type toys, clothing, and other forms of gender self-expression. And they relate to the male or female role models all around them. Note, though, that some young people identify as a combination of both boy and girl, or neither. Other transgender youth become more aware of this gender incongruity when they first begin attending school. So, which line do I get into? While for some children, this realization occurs at the onset of puberty, as lots of physical changes begin to occur. And for other folks, their awareness comes later on in life. In this cartoon, we see a spork trying to figure out which restroom matches its gender identity. Quite the dilemma. Following this realization of gender incongruence, many individuals begin to transition, often choosing a new name that better expresses who they are. Don't inquire about a transgender person's birth name or ask what their real name is. The name they have selected is their real name. And if you do happen to know the individual's birth name, always use their chosen name, even when referring to the past. For many transgender people, being misnamed can be quite an upsetting reminder of past abuse or hurtful experiences. The same request applies to your using the pronouns with which a trans individual identifies. If you aren't sure what pronouns a person uses, then just quietly ask them. Our pronouns are an integral part of our gender identity. If you make a mistake about this, or anything else, simply correct yourself and move on. Making a big deal about your error just draws more attention to it and to the trans person. Another important element of trans identity is that it's vital for people's safety to be cautious in sharing that someone is transgender or disclosing that others are gender diverse or intersex. Just because someone has shared with you or come out that does not mean they want you to be the one to spread around such personal information about them. Please respect our privacy by keeping this knowledge confidential. The transgender individual should be the one to determine who knows what and when. Respect whatever boundaries we set. An additional aspect of transitioning may include some medical interventions. These might involve taking medications and undertaking surgical procedures that can help bring a transgender person's body more into alignment with their gender identity. But that's only if they opt for this, which many trans people actually do not do. It's estimated that more than 50% of all transgender individuals never seek gender-affirming surgery, either because they don't choose those procedures or their current life circumstances do not allow for that, or because they simply cannot afford the steep cost often involved. Don't ask trans people intrusive questions regarding intimate subjects such as hormones and surgeries. Did you get the surgery? You wouldn't want somebody asking, "What's in your pants?" There's a reason they are called private parts, because they are private. Besides the surgery, surprise, there actually are numerous possible gender-affirming medical procedures, not just the one. On the other hand, it is not required that someone have these medical procedures to be transgender. By the way, transphobic naysayers are now claiming that significant numbers of transgender people supposedly regret their affirming surgeries. However, according to the Journal of Plastic and Reconstructive Surgery, a recent analysis of 27 different research studies found that the regret rate for gender-affirming operations is remarkably low, about 1%. This is in contrast to traditional cosmetic surgeries, which have a much greater regret rate, as high as 65%, according to a survey taken by the Medical Accident Group in the United Kingdom. In this regard, one more widely held misunderstanding is the notion that little kids are getting such gender-affirming medical procedures. Medical Association guidelines do not allow for that. At most, young children socially transition, perhaps choosing a new name, different pronouns, and new hair and dress styles, also known as gender self-expression. Around the time of puberty, some young people, in consultation with their healthcare team and the support of their families, may decide to use a puberty blocker medication to put a pause on that physical development. This allows more time before settling on possible next transition steps. The medication, introduced in the 1980s, has long been safely used in children for early onset puberty, and as a puberty blocker in the United States since about 2004. So this is not some new untested medicine, as many critics claim. And the standard healthcare protocol requires careful medical monitoring. In addition to the myth about transgender people regretting their affirming surgeries, anti-trans activists are now claiming alarming rates of another form of regret called detransitioning. Detransitioning means someone who has already transitioned returns to identifying as their gender assigned at birth. Some of these transphobic critics assert that as many as 80 to 90% of all trans people supposedly go through such a detransition. In actuality, though, just the opposite is true. For example, the long-term Trans Youth Project at the University of Washington recently published their study findings from a 5-year research period. The researchers found that about 94% of trans youth who had socially transitioned still retained their transgender identity after those 5 years. What about older teens and adults undertaking medical transitions? The Lancet Medical Journal reported in 2022 on a long-term Dutch study of 720 transgender teens receiving hormone replacement therapy. This research project found that after 5 years into the study, 98% chose to remain on the medication. The brilliant editorial cartoonist Sophie Labelle, who is transgender, is always spot on. I'll give you a moment to read this one. There is also a ton of anecdotal reporting from doctors indicating widespread transgender patient satisfaction, and that this healthcare is both life-affirming and enduring. For instance, Dr. Michael Irwig, Director of Transgender Medicine at Beth Israel Medical Center, stated about this detransitioning issue, quote, "My personal experience is that it is quite uncommon. I've taken care of over 350 gender-diverse patients, and probably fewer than 5 have told me that they decided to detransition or change their minds." End quote. According to the National Center for Transgender Equality, those few individuals of all ages who do detransition usually do so because they lack acceptance and support from those around them, feeling rejected by family, school, work, and the communities in which they live. One more concern that needs to be addressed is that the LGBTQ plus community has long been falsely portrayed and mistreated by hateful, bigoted individuals, organizations, and politicians. People who spread such odious talk are only displaying their inhumanity and ignorance. So much hatred, misinformation, and mistreatment aimed at the queer community results in many LGBTQ plus youth being denied unconditional love and support from their families. All too often, unaccepting parents kick these kids to the street. The Trevor Project, which works with young LGBTQ plus people across the US and Canada, recently published extensive new survey results. Trevor found that just 1/3 of all transgender and gender diverse youth felt their home was a supportive and gender affirming place to live. Just 1/3 felt safe. The Trevor Project also said that about 40% of transgender youth reported experiencing homelessness or housing instability at some point in their lives. That's a lot of trans kids. Compounding this issue within families is that same significant problem mentioned before about bigotry and rejection frequently being felt from the communities within which trans and gender diverse folks live, attend school, and work. Because of how they are treated, the transgender population has the highest rate of any group of people for self-harm or ideation and attempts to end their own lives. This rate is an estimated 40% of trans adults and as high as 50% for transgender individuals under 18. This is compared to a rate of about 4% of the general population. Trans people of color experience the worst of this. But those scary numbers drop dramatically when trans youth are affirmed by their families. Studies show that just one caring, supportive adult can make a huge difference to a transgender or gender diverse young person. And research has found that the rate of self-harm is actually reduced by up to 73% for those transgender individuals who need and obtain gender-affirming care. I've heard parents of trans youth say that they'd rather have a living transgender child instead of losing that child by refusing to accept and support them. Take a look at this. Refuse to be your child's first bully. Rather than listening to those whose prejudiced hearts are darkened by hate, please be open-minded to people who are unlike yourself. Ignorance leads to fear of the unknown, and that can cause people to reject and even detest those whom they do not even know or understand. This cartoon meme looks so simple, yet it is so profound. I appreciate you for taking the time to listen to my speech and for making an effort to become a better informed person. There are also plenty of useful LGBTQ+ resources available online and in books. Just don't expect trans people to be your personal Wikipedia and answer all of your questions. Although in some ways transgender and gender diverse people may be different from others you know, different is not evil or bad. It's just different. Like all people, we deserve to be accepted and given the same rights and respect as everyone else. As transgender activist Jazz Jennings says, get to know us. You'll love us. Thank you so much for listening and for your understanding and support.